Over 2,000 years ago, in the remote countryside of China, a man with a sparse white beard and narrow, twinkly eyes walked down a dirt path in the warm afternoon sun. He carried a gnarled walking stick fashioned from a willow tree. His garments were simple and worn, but clean. The man's face was weathered and dark from many months of being outdoors, and his feet were tough and calloused from years of travel. He walked with strength and purpose, but he did not walk quickly. Still, his companions found it hard to keep up with him. They walked a few feet behind, partly from weariness, partly from respect. They said nothing, but silently they wondered among themselves. Where were they now? Where was he leading them? When would they stop to rest? This part of China seemed almost deserted. They had passed a few empty fields, a few abandoned houses, but they'd not seen any people the entire day. There was only the chirping of birds, the occasional rustle of a breeze through the trees, and the scurry of a lizard in the underbrush. But now something else broke the silence. Was it a cry? Was it animal or human? Yes, it sounded like a woman weeping. Their teacher heard it first, for he paused, listened, and looked up ahead to the curve in the road. There they saw a peasant woman kneeling beside a fresh grave, her head in her hands, sobbing. The teacher approached the woman, and they followed. "Why do you weep so?" he asked her. The woman looked up, startled at first, and then, seeing the compassion in the man's eyes, she told her story. There was a tiger in this country, she said, a very dangerous tiger. He had killed her father-in-law. Then he had killed her husband. And now he had killed her only son. "Why then do you live in this savage place?" asked the man. "Because," she replied, "here there is no cruel government." The old man turned to his followers. "My children," he said, "always remember that oppressive government is worse even than a tiger." Then he nodded towards the road, took up his stick, and the walk continued. His disciples bowed their heads in acknowledgment and continued behind him. Their teacher, this wise man whom they called Master Kung, whom the world now knows as Confucius. For many, many years in the period between 520 and 470 BC, Confucius wandered the cities and countryside of China, observing its people and politics, and teaching his principles of noble living and right government. His words of wisdom are still being quoted a full 2,500 years after his death. Confucius is the most famous philosopher and teacher China ever produced, and among the greatest teachers in all of history. Confucius was not a spiritual leader, and he founded no religion, although many of his principles certainly aligned themselves with most people's spiritual ideals. Instead, he was a very practical teacher, working in and for the world, with a particular interest in government and political systems. He shunned the hermits and ascetics of ancient China, saying his community was not the community of animals and birds, but of men. Confucius was an early activist, but he fought not with weapons or even with passive resistance. He fought instead with knowledge. Confucius never saw himself as a prophet, as others have since. He didn't really bother himself with questions of God, or life and death, or heaven and hell. He said he could not understand death until he understood life. He was less interested in people's relationship with their Creator, and more interested in people's relationship with each other. He established certain standards and codes for assuring these relationships were harmonious ones. Instead of questions of theology, he addressed questions of ethics. In so doing, he formulated an ethical system that shaped and influenced much of Asia for over 2 millennia. His ideas have dominated Chinese society and politics for most of its history, and have had a large influence, too, on Korea, Japan, and Indochina. The teachings of Confucius are now embodied in what is called Confucianism. It can't be called a religion, but it could be called a philosophy, or even a lifestyle. As a philosophy, it focuses chiefly on the need to develop character and responsibility, or to put it simply, on becoming a good person. It has no clergy and teaches no worship. Instead, it offers a guide to morality and fair government. The Chinese government made Confucianism its official state philosophy. Chinese schools made it the basis of their curriculum. Chinese parents made it the foundation of the family structure, and individuals used it as a model for personal attitude and behavior. From 2 centuries BC to the early 20th century, it was the single most important force in Chinese life. Today it is so well integrated into the nature of Chinese culture, and so well blended with other influences such as Buddhism and Taoism, that it's sometimes difficult to tell where one leaves off and the other begins. Confucius also made great contributions to the art of teaching itself. He's known as the first teacher in China who wanted to make education available to all people, no matter what their social or economic class. And he was the first to make teaching a true vocation and a way of life. Taken together, his contributions are phenomenal. They penetrated the fabric of every area of Chinese life, reached out into all of Eastern Asia, and lasted through 25 centuries of enormous political and social change. Yet nobody would have been more surprised by this than Confucius himself. In his own lifetime, Confucius saw none of his plans and dreams realized. He was a man who lived with disappointment, whose efforts always seemed frustrated, and whose goals were always just a little out of reach. It was his destiny only to plant the seeds. The harvest would follow later. The life of Confucius was filled with challenge from the very beginning. He was born about 551 BC in the modern Shandong province, which was then a feudal state. It was an extraordinary time to be born. The 6th century was a period of remarkable spiritual renewal throughout the ancient world. It was the time of Buddha, the great spiritual master from Nepal, Mahavira, the founder of Jainism in India, the philosophers Pythagoras, Solon, and Aeschylus in Greece, the prophets Ezekiel and Jeremiah in the Near East, and in China, Lao Tzu, genius of the Tao. Yet in the midst of all this human brilliance and creativity, there was immeasurable human suffering. In China, it was a tumultuous period of history referred to as the era of warring kingdoms. China was divided into rival feudal states whose conflicts killed tens of thousands of Chinese. The people were also burdened with heavy taxes and worked to exhaustion. Famine and starvation were epidemic. This human suffering deeply affected Confucius. It is why he later developed programs of massive political and social reform. We know very little about Confucius' life. If there were any records of it, they have long since disappeared. We do know he came from an aristocratic background, but his family had lost its fortune and he was raised in poverty. It gave him just the blending he needed, an understanding of the nobility, and a compassion for the poor. He was given a traditional name, Chu, and a formal name, Chongni. Since the family name was Kong, he was later known as Kongfuzi, or Master Kong. It was Western missionaries who would give him the name Confucius hundreds of years later, but this name has no meaning to the Chinese. The hardship in Confucius' life began early. His father died when he was only 3 years old, and he was raised by a loving mother. He was self-motivated, and like many of the great people in this series, he educated himself, reading Chinese classics and spending hours of thought over them. Like all learners, Confucius was a curious man, always asking questions and seeking explanations. He lived moderately, never overindulging in life's pleasures, but not living a life of austerity either. He was said to be self-confident but kind, cheerful but thoughtful. He liked to play the lute, to sing, to fish, and to ride in his chariot. He sought masters who could teach him the arts of ritual, music, archery, calligraphy, and arithmetic. At first, he managed to make a living as a caretaker of state parks and granaries. He managed stables and kept accounting books. But because of his knowledge, he was then able to get several government posts. He was what we would call today a bureaucrat, but he was a bureaucrat with a mission. he was becoming increasingly distressed by the corruption and indifference of the government to the suffering of the Chinese people, and he was becoming more and more committed to change. In later years, Confucius advanced to become Minister of Justice in his own state, a position he hoped would give him more influence. To his dismay, it didn't. In fact, every position he held lasted for only a brief time. Each one resulted in conflicts with his superiors. In each one, he came up against a system unresponsive to his ideas, and people resistant to change. So he would take to the road in search of a new position and a new ruler who might listen to him. As Confucius traveled, he became more and more aware of the problems in Chinese society. He saw firsthand that the heavy taxes on the peasants were financing a lavish lifestyle for the royals and paying for the endless wars between feudal barons. Meanwhile, the people themselves were starving. It was the same dramatic split between the classes, the wealthy few who had everything and the masses of poor who had nothing, that leads over and over in history to revolution, war, and transformation. Confucius began to dream of revolution too, but a revolution that would take place in the minds and hearts of the Chinese rulers. He envisioned a new China of fairness, peace, and benevolence. Meanwhile, he continued to educate himself until eventually he became one of the most learned men of his time. His education was part of his search for answers to the problems of his time. He felt solutions could be found in the past, in the principles and actions of great leaders, customs, and societies that had come before. As the quality of life disintegrated in China, people lost respect for the established standards of behavior. Confucius felt the loss of tradition and ritual was a threat to society and would eventually lead to the destruction of civilization. He studied the old ways in hopes he could apply them to new problems. He went on his own private search for roots, trying to understand why certain rituals, such as worship of ancestors, reverence for heaven, and mourning ceremonies, had survived for so many centuries. These ways had now lost their vitality, but he felt if they were revitalized, they could bring order and harmony back to the disintegrating Chinese culture. Surely if he read enough, if he learned enough, if he talked enough, he could convince people to live again by the ancient principles that had once served them so well. Meanwhile, he passed his learning on to his disciples, saying, "If a man keeps cherishing his old knowledge so as continually to be acquiring new, he may be a teacher of others." Soon the road became a way of life for Confucius. He walked and walked, looking for more knowledge and understanding, and looking for people he could influence with his ideas. He joined an emerging category of wandering scholars, an ancient version of our modern-day consultants, who traveled from kingdom to kingdom offering their advice and services to local and regional governments. Lao Tzu, famous founder of Taoism, was another such scholar working for the government at this time. He held a position as state archivist. In this ancient period of Chinese history, government positions offered similar benefits to what they offer today. People liked them because they provided steady, lifelong employment to those who qualified. Confucius liked them because he believed this is where change could occur. Confucius' point of view as an advisor was quite simple. He felt that the fundamental problem of his country was that the government was more interested in the needs and pleasures of its rulers than in the welfare of its subjects. He proposed numerous reforms, including reduced taxes, milder punishments, and the avoidance of needless wars. The government wasn't interested. While Confucius was forming his political ideas, he was also gathering around him groups of young people who were active in the service of the state. Like Socrates would do 100 years later, Confucius would lead these students in discussions about principles of right and wrong, of personal good and greater good. The method he used was informal conversations in small groups of students. The general subject was what we would call ethics. The goal was to apply these ethics to government and statecraft. Confucius guided his students through an intensive course in history, poetry, and music so they could understand the cultural foundation of their time and place. They tried to identify the values and qualities in ancient traditions that could be applied to their own problems. As a teacher, he was said to be gentle and open, welcoming different ideas and encouraging independent thought. But he insisted his students have a grounding in the classics, now called the Confucian classics, because after his death, they became the main curriculum for all the schools in China. These classics included the I Ching, or Book of Changes, books on history, poetry, rituals, and ceremonies, and books of commentary. Taken together, these classics are a thorough course in all the principles that form Chinese society. It's believed Confucius may have edited many of them. Whether Confucius himself wrote any books is unknown. Some say he did, but it's almost impossible to prove or disprove. The book which records all those famous Confucius said sayings is called the Analects, or Conversations, and was written by his students after his death. Here are some excerpts. Confucius said, "He who requires much from himself and little from others will keep himself from being the object of resentment. To go beyond is as bad as to fall short. The real fault is to have faults and not to amend them. By nature, men are nearly alike. By practice, they get to be wide apart. Looking at small advantages prevents great affairs from being accomplished. What the superior man seeks is in himself. What the mean man seeks is in others." There are hundreds of these wise and pithy little sayings in the Analects, many of which the Chinese have known by heart for generations and generations. Confucius spent most of his life trying to find an administrative post that offered him the power to implement his ideas. He was in his 50s when he landed the title Minister of Justice, one he felt would surely give him some influence. Again, his hopes were dashed. There was no authority behind the title, and he resigned in despair. Miles of walking behind him, hundreds of nights without food and shelter, Confucius had still not found the post he sought. He never did. Yet while he looked east and west and north and south for the career that eluded him, there was a different career in front of him all the time. He had inadvertently become the first person in China to make a living as a philosophical teacher. He was also the first to devote his teachings to radical political reform. The principles of political reform he taught were also principles he lived. He served not just as a teacher to his students, but as a role model. There was, for instance, that hot afternoon on the plains of China when they'd been walking for hours without food and water. The country was dry and barren. Their throats were parched, their lips were cracked, and when they breathed, it felt as if they breathed only dust. Then a disciple who had kept his eyes vigilantly to the ground saw something. It was water, a hidden rain puddle sheltered by the rocks. Euphoric, he filled his rice bowl with the precious, clear liquid and offered it to Confucius. The teacher looked at him, then he looked at the others, and then he emptied the bowl on the ground. "It would be too much for one," he said, "too little for all. Let us continue our walk." And so he walked on for years and years in quest of an opportunity. At 67, when all his dreams of finding an influential post and a cooperative ruler had vanished, Confucius returned home. His followers had asked him to come and resume his teachings, and since this seemed the only way in which he could serve, he went. In spite of his disillusionments, he was not a sad man, and the twinkle in his eye never dimmed. When a student told Confucius that he'd had trouble describing him to another, Confucius said, "Why did you not simply say something to this effect? He is the sort of man who forgets to eat when he engages himself in vigorous pursuit of learning, who is so full of joy that he forgets his worries, and who does not notice that old age is coming on." Confucius taught another 5 years until he died at the age of 72. He died with joy and he died with disappointment, thinking he had failed in his heart's desire, but proud of how he'd lived. Shortly before his death, he summed up his life this way: "At 15, I set my heart on learning. At 30, I firmly took my stand. At 40, I had no delusions. At 50, I knew the mandate of heaven. At 60, my ear was attuned. At 70, I followed my heart's desire without overstepping the boundaries of right. By the time he died, Confucius had taught a total of 3,000 disciples, all from different backgrounds and different states, and of many different ages. 72 of them had mastered the classics and were considered close disciples. It was they who would carry his teachings into posterity. It was they who would prove that, far from being a failure, he had contributed more to China than almost any other person in history. The contribution of Confucius is in his teachings and what they tell us about the potential of human growth and learning. At the heart of those teachings was an adage that sounds very familiar to us in the West. It reads, "Never do to others what you would not like them to do to you." It's an earlier version of the golden rule of the Christians. But Confucius was too wise to leave his sayings open to interpretation. He prescribed exactly what one should and shouldn't do to others, whether one was an individual or a government. He established a set of rules for the way a nation and its people should think and conduct themselves. These rules were all based on what he considered the 5 basic social relationships: husband and wife, father and son, brother and brother, friend and friend, and ruler and subject. In all these relationships, there had to be li, honor or propriety. Li is sort of a catchword for an ideal standard of behavior that includes many qualities. To Confucius, this meant something particular in each of the 5 basic relationships. In a marriage, li meant justice from the husband and obedience from the wife. In ancient China, of course, the woman's role was very restricted and traditional. Confucius seldom addressed himself to women or girls or to their potential for contribution. When he talked about parents and children, he focused mostly on father and son, because again, male roles were held in greater esteem than female roles. In this case, he said, li meant the father must love the son and the son must respect the father. Li between brothers and friends meant there was always to be consideration, and the younger should always defer to the older. And finally, in the matter of government, li referred to benevolence from rulers and loyalty from subjects. If all these relationships operated well, it followed to Confucius that society in general would operate well, that a good husband, brother, and father would inevitably be a good citizen, and that a good ruler would then rule over good subjects. Confucius also offered advice to individuals. He had a description of what he considered to be the superior man. The superior man was brave, unselfish, wise, and accomplished. He was what we would call in the West a true gentleman. It didn't matter what class he was born in. What mattered was his character. He thought for himself, but he followed the rules of social conduct. He studied himself as hard as he studied other subjects, taking, as Confucius said, as much trouble to discover what was right as lesser men take to discover what will pay. The Analects, the book of Confucius' sayings, are filled with references to the superior man and how he thinks, feels, and behaves, as in, "The superior man is anxious lest he should not get truth. He is not anxious lest poverty should come upon him." Or, "The superior man is easy to serve and difficult to please." Ideally to Confucius, the greatest gentlemen of all and the most superior men would be the rulers. Their examples would inspire everyone else to lead the same worthy lives. The virtuous behavior of a ruler, said Confucius, has far more impact than laws or punishment. This quality of virtue that Confucius hoped to see in China's rulers and citizens is something he called Zhen. It's not a word that's easy to translate because it means many things at once. Zhen is love and benevolence. Zhen is loyalty and righteousness. And it is wisdom and morality. Overall, Zhen can probably be summed up as excellence in character. Zhen and Li, along with all of Confucius' principles, gradually became firmly embedded in Chinese society. He was venerated for many hundreds of years for the profound effect he'd had on Chinese thought and behavior. Yet he himself never considered himself a hero or even a sage. He said that all he really excelled in was his love of learning. Even that learning, he said, was a lower level of knowledge because it hadn't come to him directly from God. It had come from he himself, an ordinary human being with an extraordinary dedication to learning. Confucianism was expanded, modified, and adapted over the centuries until the time of the Communist Revolution, when it was banned, mostly because it looked to the past rather than the future. Today, as a school of thought and as a practice, Confucianism no longer exists in China, but its principles do. They're everywhere, in patterns of society, education, family, individual behavior, and even in government. The very government that once condemned it still exhibits a Confucian influence that separates it from similar governments elsewhere. September 28th, the day popularly believed to be Confucius' birthday, is still widely celebrated in Asia. In Taiwan, it's a national holiday called Teacher's Day. One of the greatest gifts Confucius gave the world is the principle that all people, no matter what class, education, or nature, can elevate themselves. Every individual has the potential to become, in Confucius language, a gentleman and a sage. They had only to take the responsibility for it, to educate themselves and always remain open to new learning, and to abide by certain standards of moral conduct. This was a social breakthrough in its time, a time when the class system of China was rigid and unforgiving, and people were either born to privilege or born to despair. Confucius rejected the status quo. He offered instead an aristocracy of character. This aristocracy was available to everyone, and in his utopian view, would lead to material well-being and harmony among all. In his mind, learning and teaching never existed to serve the individual only. The purpose of learning was to transform society. The real beauty of what Confucius taught is in this sense of communal learning and growth. He believed in the perfectibility of all persons, and he believed that the perfection of one individual helped us all to become perfect. His work in trying to convey that message of hope was strenuous and even dangerous. He suffered unemployment, homelessness, starvation, and sometimes even threats on his life. He experienced disappointment after disappointment and never gave up. When one ruler wouldn't listen, he tried another. If one position was a dead end, he found a new position. He died thinking his words had been unheard and his work had been incomplete. Yet by the 700s in China, all candidates for government work had to take a civil service exam based on Confucian ideas. There was no one who did not know his name, few who could not quote his words. Confucius himself had once said, "There are cases in which the blade springs, but the plant does not go on to flower. There are cases where it flowers, but no fruit is subsequently produced." One could add to that, there are cases where the fruit is produced in a different season.